Hello, everyone. I hope you and your loved ones are all safe and healthy. Welcome to an exciting webinar, which is all about putting digital transformation into practice. Essentially, how to transform effectively. And change is inevitable. Sometimes the reasons are even out of our control. However, there are things we can control organizationally and personally to best manage the change that we experience. And in this presentation, we will address a very important issue. Often in the desire to change, even with the best of intentions, we can actually stop change. We can undercut our transformation efforts significantly by not handling it well. And this is a very, very vast topic. So we'll be addressing today's webinar at a very high level. And to walk us through this will be Kevin Baer, who is a luminary in this field, having been a CTO and a CIO and advised C-level executives on effective transformation strategies. As you already know, he's also the co-author of one of the best-selling IT transformation books of all time, the groundbreaking The Phoenix Project. And we will be drawing on lessons from it today for today's discussion. It's a novel of transformation and organizational change, which brings to life the necessity, the challenges, and effective approaches to change. Now, what's really exciting, and especially exciting about this is a series of 3 webinars. They will be recorded, so we encourage you to invite your network to join because they will be very, very valuable. And the first webinar that we've already done was how to scale our most constrained resources, the Brent problem. Today's is when change management stops change, how to increase velocity and reduce risk. And the next webinar is going to be improve or lose to shadow IT, how to steadily transform an organization over time. So there are literally several dozen lessons from the Phoenix Project. So who knows, maybe we'll be able to keep this party going after these 3 webinars. And if you'd like that, please let us know, because Kevin has a wealth of other lessons that he can also do webinars on as well. So as far as an agenda, first of all, Kevin will review the homework from the last webinar. So as a great teacher and a mentor, Kevin was passionate that he wanted to make sure these webinars were not just some information that was sent out there, something that you could look at and, think that that's really interesting information and move on with life. He wants us to actually have a change and take these lessons and not just look at them, but actually digest them, understand them, and ultimately use them. So in order to do that, he's come up with some homework assignments. So we're going to start with the review of the last homework assignment. Then what he's going to do is give an overview of the 2 types of change management and how they can potentially stop change and how to get ahead of it to ensure that they don't. And then Kevin's going to tell us what the homework assignment is for this webinar, and we will open it up after that for a Q&A. So I invite you to enter your questions in the Q&A chat box that you have, and we will try to get to them as best we can during the Q&A. We've had some great questions last webinar, and we look forward to some really good ones this one. So now we'd like to hand it over to Kevin to take us on this journey of how change management stops change. Kevin?
Thank you. It's great to see everybody today, and I'm excited to talk about this topic. And I'm really, really excited to talk about the homework from last week. I actually had you read a paper, if you remember correctly, Standing on the Shoulders of Giants. And I asked you to answer 3 questions, in that email after reading this article. And this article is not only one of my favorite articles of all time, because in it actually unlocks secrets of transformation I think that everybody should understand. And it's worth reading this article many times. I, for a long time, would read this article monthly and get a lot of things out of it, as well as listening to the recording. And this is kind of a secret benefit of talking about this, listening to the recording of Beyond the Goal, which is a lecture that Eliyahu Goldratt did, after recording the goal, obviously, and also, writing the book. And basically the notion of Beyond the Goal is something that builds on what he talks about in this specific Standing on the Shoulders of Giant. And so if you want to kind of get the gist of that article, it's essentially, from my perspective, one of the main messages are, how do you actually take a universal principle that you want to adopt in your organization and figure out, given your constraints, your organizational constraints, if you remember, Ono in this article, one of the things going on at Toyota whenever they were actually trying to increase production is that they were bankrupt, right? And so that meant that they could only make cars that they had order for. So the kind of one of the important things to remember about that is, and I'll be quick with this here, is that the long end of it is that it was a constraint. They were bankrupt. They had a bunch of inventory that people didn't want to buy. And so for them to make new, they had to have an order. And this actually became an underlying tenet of the Toyota production system, showing the principle of you must take the idea that's universal, run it through a sieve of your constraints, and then take what comes out the other side. What is it that you would do with this universal principle in light of your constraints? And one of the things that Ono developed and that everybody at Toyota really, really still talks about to this day is one by one flow at the lowest cost. In other words, we're going to take that thing that was put on us as a limitation and we're going to turn it into an advantage. Remember that. That's important. So what kind of production system did Ono want to model Toyota after? It was the Ford production system, where literally Ford conceived of raw materials going in one side of the actual factory plant and finished cars rolling out the other side. And he did. He set the world record for doing that in the quickest amount of time at the time, from going from raw materials to cars. So they wanted to use the Ford production system, but unfortunately, in his current situation, he couldn't amass enough inventory or enough space to do that, because both of those were required. So Ono figured out how to make a lot of cars with half the floor space and in half the cycle time and with half the defects. And that's the journey that they all discovered together over time. But why he couldn't do that, which I brought up, which was just literally because they didn't have the space or the luxury of the dollars. So they were constrained by dollars and space. Really, really big differences for that. So he actually took Ford's methods and his overall design and changed them to actually be part of that. So when you're adopting a method into your organization, be very careful adopting something wholesale and literally as it is on a page. You actually have to take your organizational constraints and run those ideas through them to figure out where you can start. It doesn't mean that's where you're going to end, but that means that's where you need to start. So when creating Toyota production system was a constraint that Dr. Ono had to adjust for. I told you this a little bit. They were bankrupt. And this is kind of amazing. I think we all have situations where we lack the capital that we would like to move forward with our work or our improvements. So I always take this as inspiration. We can figure out how to do this without any budget, without any staff, or any air, if we apply the thinking tools that Goldratt laid out for us in Theory of Constraints. All right, so now I want to actually talk a little bit about how change management can get in our way. And I think that a lot of us over time have had frustrating experiences with change management. I'm going to talk a little bit about two broad areas of change management. This word literally is so overloaded, both words actually. And so I want to talk a little bit about two situations with change management that you might run into as yourself. So firstly, we're going to look at change management from an organizational perspective, and then we're going to look at it from an IT operational perspective. All right, so I think most of us have experienced a situation, or I'm going to flip through the whole time here. Organizational change management. If you've been through any kind of large organizational org change, or maybe even a digital transformation, or some projects where multiple business units need to get aligned, you might have heard the term organizational change management, or OCM. Organizational change management is typically focused on managing changes in two areas. Adaptive change would be the things that businesses need to adjust to on an ongoing basis continually. So a price change in the marketplace may happen, and we need to figure out adaptively, like we got to adapt to that and somehow figure out organizationally how we need to match that and what we need to do tactically to get those offers out in the marketplace and to our customers. So things like that. Or we want to add a feature to the website because we found out that people want to do something that they can't do now. So we're going to adapt to that need. So these are the ongoing projects, initiatives. They can be quite large, but there's ways that the company copes and adapts to the current market conditions or things that it anticipates we need. So these are, network refreshes or adaptive changes, right? Things that we put in to improve performance and speed things up are adaptive. Now, transformative changes means that we're taking our company somewhere where its capabilities currently are not. So we're looking, at how do we actually change the nature or the abilities of our company. And so what we're looking at is our organization needs to do something that it is not able to do now. What must we do? What steps must we take to gain those particular capabilities, but also change our behaviors to leverage those capabilities? So organizational change management is often about messaging, giving people an idea of what's going on through the change, and in many ways trying to help people adapt, because it can be scary and it can be hard. So one of the things I've found is that I really have a fundamental belief that if organizations are not good at adaptive change, or even smaller changes than that, which would be things like continuous improvement, which in many ways are adaptive change, but also can be part of transformative change. So if we can't do those simple muscle movements of making change and solving the problems that come with it, we're probably not going to be able to transform very gracefully. So when we look at effective messaging and communication about change, it is really messaging that becomes the bedrock of what they're really focusing on. Often, I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where messages that we get about change, either from the organizational change management consultants that we hired, can actually scare us. And so, I think the thing that we should look at is how come that is the case, and why are organizations making messages that actually kind of maybe do the opposite of what they're intended to do. Remember in the Phoenix Project, Bill Palmer had kind of starts out in this scenario where he finds out that the CEO had fired both of his bosses, right? And he's kind of now running things. And if you remember Bill's background, I mean, while he was a very regimented and focused individual, he was not a CIO, right? He had a mainframe background. He was not the guy that saw himself as being the leader of all IT. And matter of fact, I think he's uniquely flawed in a way that some of us are also flawed when we find ourselves in these situations, almost like you're never ready. But would you be anxious when you're presented with this scenario of both incredible opportunity, visibility, a chance to really, succeed, but also the incredible fear of the fact that you don't understand exactly what happened with those two. And now somebody you don't talk to on a daily basis is now in your world talking to you about running the organization. I would be a little bit frightened. I mean, if you were other people in the organization and you found out both of your CIOs and your organization has been fired, number one, number two, I'm not sure how I would feel. If you're Wes, thinking about, gosh, my career opportunities here just kind of got strange. I had this figured out before and now I don't. Patty, who's really concerned about, things operating correctly and people keeping their word, right? Or John, right? Who's now immediately concerned about all of the terrible possibilities that are present from a security perspective without two people in leadership. So we need to think about the implications of what those changes mean. If an organization basically feels like its enemies are internal, in other words, if we have the idea that some people are stopping us from doing what we need to do in our organization, there might be the enemy of success or enemy of change, then we have a real problem. And this is where tribalism comes into play, right? The notion that tribes exist to protect our individual safety and our individual value by protecting tribal value and tribal safety. And tribes exist everywhere in your organization. One quick way to actually find them is to look for all of the flags that exist in your organization, the universities, the pro football teams. These are all tribal identifications. So we identify with our school, with our, all of our alma maters in life. And so one of the things that we have to think about is when organizations get messages that are scary, they often see the need to form tribes. They could be departmental tribes. You could have a network security tribe and an operations tribe. And sometimes they war. when their priorities are different or they feel like their value is being taken away or put into question. So we need to really think about, in your org, take a little bit of time to think about, hey, where are some tribes that have conflict? This is not usually the direct result of the conflicts that they're having.
So, Kevin, you brought up a really interesting point that is not really discussed so much at all, and that's the role of communication and messaging as an essential success criteria of transformation. We don't generally realize that it can inspire and accelerate change, or lack of it, or if it's not done well, could cause anxiety, stress, hinder change, and even, as you said, even cause tribalism. So I wanted to take this concept just a little bit further and ask you a quick question here. So related to this idea of communication, there are a couple concepts that are really gaining a lot of mind share recently, and that is organizational empathy and psychological safety. So how do those play a role in organizational change management? How can those be incorporated as well?
That's a great question. I mean, there's a couple things that come to mind right off the bat. One of the things I find particularly terrible in a lot of the organizational change management communications that I've looked to is a lack of effective foreshadowing. And what I'm talking about is if you're hearing about a change in your organization, one of the things that's really important for somebody to think of whenever mentioning the change is understanding that folks immediately try and figure out, where do I fit into this change? And is there some sort of clue or signal that I'm getting that maybe I might not be needed in this new transformed thing? In other words, maybe the company's transforming away from me, or maybe it feels like it's transforming away from me and my tribe. So it can exacerbate fears that we already have. And I think the really important thing to grasp is when we can foreshadow the opportunity, when we can foreshadow the notion of security where we know it exists, every little piece that we can give people to hang on to, because that's the thing I don't think we mention. We mention a lot of times like how great it's going to be when the thing is changed, how great this new world will be. But if we don't hear the language that allows us ourselves to paint that, I think we can get really frustrated.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that, that may be something for a future webinar, because it sounds like that's actually a really important point. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that is something to consider. I mean, so, even as we think about how we're going to message change, it's really important to understand, first of all, what tribes are in the organization and how might those tribes actually interpret the message, which means as a leader, one of the things you really need to know is, what is the social fabric like in your organization? The key pieces of the value flow have social components to them. So make sure that those guilds and tribes and things that actually can help, those tribes can work together when they see common opportunity or common enemies, and they will actually join together as a super tribe. So your job as a leader is to give them those common goals, those common focuses, and where appropriate, common enemies, things that threaten our current existence, to work against. So that is a really important. Raise the threshold of importance of the work you need to do on these transformations above the fray of the political and psychosocial melee that may be going on in your organization. It's very important. So, technology change management. What is the goal of change management in operations? If you talk to different people in the org, you're going to get just very predictable responses about this. I can walk through a lot of organizations now and say, hey, so tell me about change management, developer. And I'm going to hear about forms and confusing notions of, different meetings and things that you have to go to, almost like tribunals, where you have to present your justification and all of the things that need to get done to make your change successful. Almost like you have to negotiate the legitimacy and safety of your change every time. If I talk to operators, they'll talk about this victim kind of situation that they feel like they're in, where changes are kind of foisted on them and people don't necessarily tell you all the details of their change. Or even scarier, if you're in operations, they don't know what their change is actually going to do. So one of the big problems in operations that we have where change management becomes important is we get multiple changes. Operations is a many-to-one set of relationships, which is very important to understand. In development, we don't have a lot of many-to-one style relationships at the scale, especially of operations. And so what we want to think about is, how do we allow operations people to understand as much about changes as possible, and also then limit the variation possibilities for them. And I think we can talk a little bit about that in another talk that we can hear from Jay Bloom on the three economies. It is a brilliant way to look at that. But the point is that the goal of change management in operations isn't to prevent change. It's not even to prevent risky change. This is something we need to think about. We need to rethink change management. It has a lot of goals, but at the end of the day, it is adaptive change. And it is also at the heart of our transformative change. So why do we put brakes on cars then? And this is the thing I think we have to really think about with change management. I hear this analogy used a lot. I used it many times since the late 90s. But I think we put brakes on cars, not just so that we can stop, but we can actually drive fast. And what you look at as braking technology has gotten better, so has racing, and so have the speeds that cars are capable of safely navigating. So I always say we put brakes on cars because we want to go faster, right? We want to go faster than the speeds we were willing to crash at. So the goal of managing change or managing speed in an organization is to be able to go fast. Now, the problem with going fast means that doesn't mean we can be careless and just say everything happens, right? But we actually have to move towards the old kind of fortress or preventative mentality that we have, to actually really focusing on flow, and that change management is a part of a flow of work. And so if we actually start to look at that as part of a value stream, we actually start to see things like completeness and accuracy and cycle times. But the goal is not just to make everything perfectly accurate, right? The goal is, let's engineer a system where it's easier to do the right thing than it is to do the wrong thing. Also, where systems tell you that they did things rather than people on the honor system. So system level attestation of change becomes really important. So if the goal of making change something that we can do as fast and safe as possible, then we start to rethink change management. We think about automated patterns. We think about how do we enforce governance at the point of change, but not curtail appropriate adaptive emergence at the point of change. So the goal is as much change as we can make, as safely as we can make it, as fast as we can make it. So one of the ways we can modernize change management is by taking the legitimate concerns and fears that have been built up over the years in that area of all of the terrible things that can happen. But then we have to understand that there's probably a better way to address those needs than all the way through a value stream where the work is about to get done. It almost becomes like change management, a sign of that change management is it's pure inspection towards the end of a very long process. So one of the things we need to think about is addressing those concerns that we lay out and we've memorialized over time with the pig over the wall of confusion, a lot of what actually now has almost become cliche. And I think we have to think about taking that and moving it left of the process in a value stream kind of concept and talk about what can we automate to make all of this checking go away? What can we actually build into requirements? And then how do we assure that as we move through those processes that we can check for those things and attest to them in an automated way? And so things like standard changes now mean that they better not be going in front of a change advisory board. Matter of fact, you need to revisit the whole notion of a change advisory board because it's just not going to be fast enough. Putting 50 to 60 people in a room for an hour wastes 50 to 60 human hours. So that is not a good way to do this. There has to be a better way to distribute that work to the left of process in its correct domains. So now you need to think of change management, and everybody else that's involved in making changes needs to think of that process as being a key part of making change happen, but also being a bottleneck. And bottlenecks, by the way, not all bottlenecks are constraints. Sometimes we reduce the width of the flow to create better observability. The problem is that our ability to observe is slower than our ability to automatically execute. So one of the things that we have to do is create the idea that observation needs to be done by machines where possible. And remember, humans need to do the things that humans are good at, judgment, and computers and systems need to do the things that they're good at, which is repetitive, detail-oriented work involving computation, right? So I want to talk to you a little bit about where we can kind of expand on these ideas. I've got some homework for you, just like last week. And this book is a little bit of a different book. It's a novel. And last week, I asked you to read a paper. It was a thesis. This is a different book. This is a novel. And I'm going to give it to you just like a professor would give it to you in a syllabus. But I'm going to make a disclaimer because we don't have a normal class to talk about these things. But I'm going to actually give you books and material and homework over time in this series and in other series. And I want you to understand that while I give you books, it doesn't mean that I endorse every idea or thing in the book. Matter of fact, a lot of great ideas come from a lot of folks that are pretty flawed. If you've studied any kind of philosophy over time, there's a lot of really flawed philosophers. It doesn't mean they didn't have a couple of good ideas. So one of the things that I want to make sure that as you read this book, this isn't an endorsement of some of the more macho kind of stuff at the end, which I take and leave. But I do want you to understand that the focus of this book, the concept of how tribes can be identified, worked with, and messaged to is absolutely critical. Anybody that works with me knows I dropped this book out of airplanes along with a lot of other books. Ray Immelman actually had a chance, the author of this book, he consulted a lot with Goldratt. And so these are lessons he learned while he was working with Ellie and on a lot of other projects that involved constraints. And in this book, I think he really shows us how our communications and our messaging becomes a constraint. We have to take our organizational change far beyond Kotter's Kotter on change. The things he outlines are very top down and very linear. And so we need to think of change in some cases like we think of death. We have a process that we go through, and it's not in order. Some of us go through denial, grief, bargaining. We go through those in a dynamic process. And so I think communications lives in that same kind of a world where it is not linear. We just don't tell people a week ahead, and then they know a week later what they're going to do. Western mindset about getting everybody on the same page before we do something, not always the best way to do things. Sometimes we just need to do things so that we can learn. So read Great Boss, Dead Boss, and I want you to look at a couple of things here, actually 5, and they're pretty broad things. How hard is it to start a tribe? There's a great set of anecdotes in here, and you can read them. Name an example from the book of how fast this can happen. Just, how many actions were involved in starting a tribe, and what kind of situations were in place already there that it made it so quick. How, are tribes reunited? In a sense, tribes are schisms that form over time. And one of the things we want to think about is how do they come back and reunite as a whole? Is that possible? Are the rifts that great that we can't actually heal them over time? I want to think about when you read this book, what situations were you reminded of? Specifically, pick one that you were reminded of as you read this book. A lot of people go to an immediate internal situation when they kind of get this feel for what's happening. Also, make sure that you really kind of clue into organizational change management messaging. When you read the things that he's talking about, or you kind of look at in your own organization as a parallel, how does the messaging you're hearing kind of line up with what you've just learned in Great Boss, Dead Boss? What are the things you think could be better? Make a point of listing that out, because this will become your personal set of like almost checklist and heuristics for how you communicate to your team at first. And start to ask people, hey, did that message bring us together? Do you feel like you understand how you need to work with other people? And be careful, by the way, of asking leading questions like I just asked. You want to determine those things, right? Understand your power as a leader will cause a lot of folks, in many cases, to feel like they don't want to have a conflict with you, so they'll agree a lot quicker. So learn how to ask questions in a way where people don't feel like they're on the hook for your answer that you want. So saying all of that, I hope that you get a lot out of Great Boss, Dead Boss, and I look forward to discussing homework with some of you. And I think this is going to really, really help bring home what I talked to you about today. So thank you.
So wonderful overview, Kevin. Your passion for this topic, which really in the end of the day is Kevin's passion, for those who can't tell already, is he really is passionate about change being done right. So it's always great to see your passion come to life. I was going to mention also, as far as the homework, again, this is a masterclass by Kevin, and he really wants to make sure that these lessons are actually implemented. So this supplemental information, The Great Boss, Dead Boss, is available on Kindle. A little bit hard to find on paperback, but it is available on Kindle. So before we launch into the question and answer, I thought it might be helpful just to give a brief summary about the two types of changes that Kevin highlighted in this. First, Kevin went over organizational transformation, which generally is focused on adaptive and transformation change. And as we heard, he laid special emphasis on communication and messaging. Why? Because after all, we are impacted by our human psychology and emotions. We are, and the people that are being affected by the change. So it's a great point, and it's something that's very often overlooked. So it's a great point that Kevin highlighted that. And by the way, for those who are interested, I'll put it in the chat. He also alluded to a famous paper in the Journal of Applied Behavioral Sciences, where researchers drew parallels between organizational change and the 5 stages of grief. And in fact, they called it, the paper is very well known, it was entitled Organizational Change as a Process of Death, Dying, and Rebirth. And they used theories from psychoanalysis and group dynamics to explain individual and group level organizational change. So this stuff is really very intertwined with who we are as people. So the second thing he talked about was technical operations change management, and he was contrasting the old and the modern goals. The former, meaning the old goals, were more around removing risk and preventative controls, and the more modern aspect that he talked about is creating a framework and actually fully reframing change management as flow, not as some point in time, but it's something that we actually can do as a flow so we can automate and reduce friction. So we evolve our focus and even our goals. So there's a lot of different questions, many threads that we can pull from this. And I wanted to start off with one question, Kevin, and then we can go into some that were also some of the others as well. So Kevin, given all that you talked about, oftentimes when we start change, we discover new problems through our change. So what can problems discovered during organizational change tell us, and what are some ways we can start to integrate that into the change itself?
All right, so I'm going to start if you're a line person. So if you do actual work and you are focused on making incremental change, or you work on projects, but in other words, you actually have hands on keyboards doing something. A lot of times, some of the dissonance that we can feel whenever a change is, told to us, essentially, because sometimes we're the last to know. Matter of fact, I won't say sometimes, often we're the last to know about an organizational initiative. And so one of the things that can be really frustrating is that as we dig into what's being said, we kind of shovel through the layers of fluff and kind of word pictures. I think it can be very frustrating to realize that technically we may be so far behind, or we may be such a large gap between what you're saying and where we are because of things you don't know in the details of our operation. So that actually betrays feedback loops as a problem. And so I think that in terms of executive management, not actually talking to folks on the line where change is actually going to hit hard, and finding out before we go and announce to everybody and do the happy path talk that we have some serious things that we need to address. And I think that becomes a much more credible message. If you're a director and you hear about a change from above and you know how to decode maybe 35 or 40% of the fluff, and you've shoveled that off of the message, and you're looking in there and you're going, wait a minute, this may sound like a staff reduction to me. This is framed as a big enterprise capability change. But what we're really seeing is we've got consultants in here cutting and reducing in operational areas, maybe even to try and pay for the large enterprise transformation. And directors know that there's not a whole lot they're going to be able to do with less resources, with less people, with less everything. So the change becomes like this contradiction and almost a cognitive dissonance for them of, here we go again. I've got folks at the top who think that they can just will their way through things and declare success, and I'm going to be left holding the bag and maybe even the pink slip. So, because we love to, that's one of the things that happens, by the way. For whatever reason, organizations are all about trying to cut in middle management instead of understanding what it's good for and how it can be directed in a change. So this is something we see all the time, and it's very short-sighted. You wind up hiring them back again at more expense. So if you're a CEO and you hear problems during this change, the first thing you think of is, why does everything get stopped in middle management? There's such a strange belief system that everything happens just fine until middle managers get a hold of it, and then they've got to figure out how to extend their careers, increase their organizational footprints. This is a total legend. Really, at the end of the day, and I'm not saying that there aren't some folks that try and do that, but at the end of the day, that is a big problem, that perception. And I think it also betrays, again, a lack of understanding of the organizational and operational challenges that fly in the face of what the company is saying. A lot of answer there, but
yeah, there's a lot of answers there. And as I was telling people when we kicked off this webinar, we could potentially, I mean, each of these questions, there's some great questions that came. Each one of them could be a webinar itself. So, but thank you, Kevin. That was a great quick answer. We have a lot of really good questions here. So go ahead. So
I look forward to blowing these out in another webinar.
Yeah, we have some really fantastic questions here, actually, that pull on a lot of different threads. So one that comes from the federal government side. So the question is, the federal government still has regulations that insist on a CCB or a CAB type of entity. And our org is trying to bring that as low as possible so that only the changes that need approval and oversight will have a human in the loop. So basically, if you just change some wording on a website, it doesn't have to go through the whole change process. How do we help outside our organization people understand this? So how do they gain momentum? How can they actually help within the federal government context, especially, although it's very relevant commercial? So what are your thoughts on that, Kevin?
This is hard, and there's a couple things I'll kind of talk about that are prescriptions to this, because this is probably one of the most important problems that people face, which is that barrier that you're talking about, where there is a code, there is a rule, right? In some cases, OMB, the folks you used to have to please to get your funding had rules, and some of them may be draconian, to different people. So I understand what you're saying, and I certainly understand being mandated to waste people hours or human hours every week just because there's something written that says you have to do that is counterintuitive. So the couple of things. First thing is, there's plenty of science on this that shows that those old approaches are slower, not as safe, and actually cost more. The first place I look at, actually, it might be unlikely for some people because it is a little bit more oriented in the development space, would be the book Accelerate. And I'm not a big fan of handing out books that talk about metrics and build cases for metrics, but I do like a few things that come out of this book. And one of them is just the picture of a system. Imagine a system that's accelerated. This is what it looks like in the book. Now, again, when I went back and I talked to you about, hey, how did Ono make change, right? In Toyota? Again, you need to take a book like Accelerate and put it through the sieve of your constraints to find a starting point. Secondly, one thing I would do is talk to somebody at Red Hat about doing an executive exchange. I would love to come in and talk with the folks that have this kind of policy in their purview. It's going to take a group of people to make these changes, and I'm sure you know that better than I do. On the federal government side of things, it's often an entire group of people that maybe aren't even related in the way they work together. They're not easy to address. So one thing I'd love to do is work with an executive exchange and support you through a change like that. I think that's something that we have the unique ability to do at Red Hat with the Global Transformation Office and people like Yasser and myself and Andrew, and Jabe and I just really think that this is something that we can pull and help with you with. The second thing is I would also get them a copy of the Phoenix Project and see if you can't do a reading group, especially when Patty's got all the changes up on the board and actually trying to figure out from a Kanban style how they're going to get them all done. So those things, I think, both like some reading groups, some science-based presentations on velocity and how things actually can work in a high-performing organization. And then there are other people in government that are suffering with the same thing you are. Let's work on getting them together, and so that we can kind of prevent a unified voice to this stuff.
Yeah, and as Kevin said from the beginning, it's hard. But there are ways, and I think those are three actually, in fact, ways that you mentioned. One is, the books, both books, Accelerate and the Phoenix Project. And as Kevin said, for those who don't know, Kevin actually works and is one of the main leaders in our global transformation office, and we do set up these executive exchanges, which have been very enriching discussions with your senior management. So I would say that if you're on this webinar, you are a thought leader within your organization. So if you're looking to kind of get some more excitement in your organization, get some buy-in in what you're trying to do, I would definitely recommend reaching out to us, and we could set up an executive exchange with Kevin and some of our other GTO folks. And it's proven to be, I don't want to say surprising, but very enriching. So thank you, Kevin. So here's another one, Kevin. Great question.
Yeah.
So how to motivate employees emotionally to adapt to the changes when they see comfort with the old processes, without showing interest to learn the new. So how do you motivate for change, essentially?
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. One of the reasons I talk about change and empathy and psychological safety a lot is that in my own life, I have gone through a lot of change and continue to need to change. I'm a very flawed individual, kind of seeking another level of happiness and enjoyment and peace. So one of the things that I think in my own life that I've come across is the need to exercise. And specifically, I have particular problems. And so there is a physical therapy element to that exercise. But I'm lazy and I don't like to do things that I don't like to do. So one of the things I had to grasp on, because I sure love, playing my drums or picking up a guitar and making a lot of noise, much to the chagrin of my neighbors, right? And I don't want to get there and down on the machine and row, or I don't want to do those special weird stretches that kind of make me cramp. But here's the way I finally figured out to do them. Every time I feel pain, every time I have that thing happen that's not supposed to happen if I did the exercises, I remind myself that there's an alternate reality that I'm choosing to not participate in. And I ask myself about that. Is the payoff really better doing the thing that gives me the result that falls short every time? Or is the payoff better when I do the right thing, but then later on I feel the result? And so I think it comes down to a lot of times we don't want to change our behavior because we don't understand how our total outcome and our total life will change, because it's impossible to. And sometimes we overstate those things, or management does, to try and create that impetus to change. So we get cynical. But the truth of the matter is that the more you connect to the need to change for the organization, in other words, what is going to happen now that couldn't if you all behave this way? And who does it help? And how does that help you feel better and maybe have a better situation? So the hard part is that sometimes there's no short-term payoff, right? You got a bunch of work you got to grit through, and then there's a maybe. And then in work, there's this other dynamic of the other people. How do I know they're going to change too? How do I know I can trust them, right? I'm doing a lot of air quotes here. The point is that you, unfortunately, or fortunately for them, get to trust first if you really want to make change happen. And you, unlike others, may model that change first. And it may be hard. And you may feel like you're an idiot. Because in fact, you may not be succeeding at the way or in the rate or rate that you think you should be with this new behavior. It takes time. And here's the key belief that I think successful leaders learn how to embody. It's called suspending your disbelief. We do this to watch a movie without. We've seen that actor. How many of us have a spouse or a mate or a partner that'll say to us in the middle of the movie, hey, wasn't that person in? And then you're like, your whole IMDb opens up, right? And they start creating all of those things. They say, hey, they were in this, they were in that. So what that bothers me, the reason that drives me nuts is I'm busy suspending disbelief that that actor is now the character. That is the most key part of change, is visualizing. We hear about this with really high-performing athletes all the time. Being able to see their way through the stroke, right? Being able to not be the ball, but actually see the ball go where it wants to go, where we want it to go. And as we visualize, just with change, we can actually see good outcomes. We can actually imagine what those outcomes feel like in our belly. Hey, that's great. I feel proud of myself. Hang on to that. Feel that a little bit. And just remember that that's what it is you're getting. It is delayed gratification, and in some cases delayed by a lot of friction. But you have to almost put on blinders and just do it and keep doing it. And that's why I like routines like katas that are simple starter change methods that allow us to get used to what it feels like to do change. If you ride a Peloton, if you ride a real bike, if you run, if you do anything that pushes your body on a regular basis, you know what this is about. You fundamentally feel where that conflict is. It's much less than that in work. It's just much more constant.
Yeah. And I think, Kevin, again, this could be a whole webinar in and of itself. A series, actually, of how to motivate emotionally, how to emotionally motivate, right? And I think the one thing I might add to that is that two things is that as Kevin started the whole discussion, the word change has been used as a blunt object in our organizations. And generally when people hear change, they get worried. So when they start to realize that this change is in their best interest, as Kevin said, that can be a fantastic way to really position change as, hey, this will make your life better, and this is how, is one of the things that can be that can one approach. But there's many, many more. So, and think of it, as Kevin said, think about it in our own personal lives.
Here, it's critical.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So thank you for that question.
It's really critical to understand in your organization where the friction is.
Yeah. Because even that person that may not want to change, there's something about what they're doing that they could get potentially excited about. There's some benefit that could come out of the change. So thank you for that question. We have another question here. We have several questions.
That's the heart of.
Yeah. So
these other ones.
Yeah, we have time for just a couple more here, depending on how long they take. But here's another one. And these are what's really fun about these webinars is, as you know, we are Red Hat. We are an open source software company, but we're not talking technology today because technology is not enough. It's a great enabler, but if you don't deal with some of these issues, as we know, and this is why we created the Global Transformation Office, if you do not deal with the cultural issues, the people, I don't want to say people issues, but the human aspect of it, then your technology will not get where you want to go. So the question is, what are some of the best ways to help worker bees encourage trust from managers when they start automating previously human-controlled processes? So automation can have a negative context for the worker bees, as was mentioned here.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times, from my perspective, I think there are, from a confidence perspective, there's a couple of elements that come to think of. One is you want them to be able to see information. I call this, a lot of people that have worked with me in the past know what I'm talking about when I say your leaders want to be able to see the launch pad. So if you can almost think of it this way, you're talking about a space mission to your director. They've never been to space. They've never seen a rocket. They don't even understand the timeline. They don't understand all the checklists. They don't understand the process. But every week you come in and you tell them, we're getting ready to launch. And they're like, all right, taking your word for whatever that means. I've got a lot of ambiguity. But because I'm a level or two above you in the organization, I'm that much more comfortable with ambiguity. And so you're like, wow, I kind of skated out of that, didn't have to give them a lot of detail, just told them the thing's going to go. And then all of a sudden, that social capital, which is what it is, runs out. Because what happens is they can't paint a picture for the people above them that is got enough fidelity or detail that shows them that this particular person knows what they're talking about. So what you've got to give folks that you're working with is the ability for them to be trusted with the information that you give them. Now, that can be hard because, again, we know every level of the org you go up, you know more about less. In other words, you know more about variety, right? Every level you go down in the org, you know more about less, right? Instead of less about more as you go up. So I think that the thing we've got to find is how we give them information that's compelling with less detail. And so that's one piece. Secondly, it's really, really important to understand that for these processes, actually going back to the first thing, if you give them a picture from a standpoint of like a dashboard or some sort of intelligence that they can go get that tells them what they care about, or at least structures a conversation with them that you can have proactively, and even better, they will be able to project answers before questions are asked, which is very important. So give them the tools to move beyond your conversation to another conversation above them, and ask them about what that's like. Hey, who do you have to send this to? So that's a very important, the social aspect of that. And then secondly, it's really, really interesting if you start to get some folks in touch with the work. And matter of fact, John Willis in the Global Transformation Office is doing a big, big project with automated attestation. Matter of fact, there's a lot of movement among banks, government entities, and different organizations that need to know that, that somebody didn't mess with this attestation, right? Literally, it was done by a machine. And I think what we can find is that a world where I jokingly say that friends don't let friends attest to change. Friends let friends have computers attest to change. Because the one thing an auditor wants to know is, can I trust a system? And one of the ways they know that they can trust your system is, can your system operate without you relying on this control? In other words, another way to say that is, do you have to rely on this control to operate? That gives them the ability to trust the control, right, after doing some checking. So one of the things that this can actually really do to help, and I think management needs to understand this, is less of a burden at audit time. Like, we're doing more difficult work here to shift this work left in the process so that when auditors come, they can be more self-service. So when you understand the pain that your leaders have around audit, around compliance, around just regulatory pieces, I think it's really important to be able to come back to them and say, hey, I understand that's a concern for you. Get their concerns out of them about what they have to talk to other people about. It will inherently almost act like a file that will give you the structure to give them information to pass on. It's very important. It's a big part of what directors do. They're both horizontal and vertical communications, and they give us cross-functional alignment if things work correctly. Give them messages that travel. That is important.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. To kind of add to that, or to actually just to focus again. So as Kevin's saying, so as far as the worker bees, it's as the question was asked, what can managers do to get that trust? As you're automating things, it should be making the worker bees' life better, because they are dealing with those attestations as well, and the difficulty that comes with them. What's that?
Yeah, I got that reversed. So I was talking about if you're in that position, what you can do to earn trust. But from a manager's perspective, it's really, really important, because what you need to actually foreshadow for folks is, hey, here's the work you get to do if we don't have to waste our time doing the stuff that we used to do manually. And then also remember all of the issues. And as a manager, you can present the cross-functional organizational issues that they may not see in terms of the effects of this type of situation, right? So yeah. I think that we now have to think about it from a systemic standpoint. And if management has a job, it's to help folks that work in a system on the line, or, like we're saying here, worker bees, right? People that do the real work, help them understand in a way that they don't have to go and look all around them all the time. Help them understand what's going on in the organization from a context perspective, so that they can understand how their behavior affects the system. And I think if management can do that in a way that's real and not fake, and also not hyper cause and effect. In other words, where there's a ton of blame. I think this is a great way to educate people. Yeah, I understand. This seems amazing locally. This seems like what you should be doing. This feels like more work. But what we've done is we've actually reduced a lot of work for a lot more people than just you folks. And those people are grateful for what you're doing. And, again, bringing in the more system-wide context to show them why. The why behind
and
these
how
things
they're important in that system.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's the managers show that these worker bees, you're not just some pointless worker bee. What you're doing is valuable, and that's employee engagement. And they've done studies now that as you engage, and meaning is one of the most effective ways of instilling that engagement. So I think that's perhaps another aspect. So we have about 3 minutes. So I'm going to ask one final question. We had several more that we didn't get to, but I did want to ask one more. And then Kevin, I'm going to ask if you can maybe wrap up in 2 or 3 minutes, that question. But before I do that, I did want to remind everyone, this was the second in a 3-part webinar series. So we do want to encourage you to go ahead and see the first one. And then when you did this one, try and do the homework, because we're going to start the third one, which is going to be about avoiding shadow IT, which is a big, big topic. And the way you do that is through continuous transformation. So with that being said, Kevin, another great question here. Again, each one of these is a webinar itself, but the question is how to deal with the conflicts among the cross-functional leaders affecting the change. So you want to do change, but now you have conflict in the different functional areas. How do we get over that, Kevin?
Well, I think traditionally organizations have concentrated power. And unfortunately, functionally driven organizations, which I believe I can't tell you how long, maybe since client server became a thing, or the PC became a thing in the 80s, and we went from having a core group of people that specialized on systems, applications, systems of record, to having somebody who focused on clients, servers, networks, databases, and we split this all into a million pieces. And so one of the things that we found is in the modern enterprise, everything's hyper-functionalized. You have a group where, if we were in a factory, the way I would joke is that we would have all of the saws people that sawed machinery in one corner, all the people that pounded on things in another corner reporting to another leader, all of the things where people put screws in things, we literally separate them by their disciplines and basically ruin an assembly line. So one of the things to understand with functionality and functional roles is flow is real. And all of your work comes from somebody, and all of your work goes to somebody. So departmental boundaries are a deceiving and sometimes really, really confusing way to see work. And so leaders in those organizations, it's incumbent upon them to actually align across functions. This is what DevOps essentially is. I'm tired of walking into organizations and seeing a DevOps team. I think we may have failed. The first thing I'll often say, because DevOps is what happens between functions, and they cross-functionally align to do something bigger than what they're doing internally, and in a way that actually expresses the flow of work, right? And so I think that, a lot of times when we have functional leadership, we get what's called local optimization, and Eliyahu Goldratt talked about that, right? Where we optimize what's locally for our group, and we prevent the system from doing what it needs to do. So if we have like a warlord nation where we've got people that have power and they aren't, doing anything but looking out for their respective tribes, by the way, again, that comes into the notion of tribalism, figuring out what they have to protect themselves from. Why is there an enemy internally? What is it that they're all warring against? What are they really afraid of? And at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. So no matter how technically amazing somebody comes across in a meeting, no matter how passionate somebody comes in a meeting that says, I don't want to change, at the end of the day, you might actually have to consider that fear may be real, and that something, you all need to do is actually try and figure out, how are we going to do this together? What can we get done together? And, start there. But again, cross-functional alignment is how flow is executed. It's not that we rail against silos. It's that we actually figure out how to build a system that moves blood and nerve energy through all of those silos so that we're connected.
It's all connected. That's a great way to wrap up, Kevin. So again, today was about how change management can stop change and what we can do to address that proactively. So thank you everyone for joining, and the questions were fantastic. I apologize if we couldn't get to some of them, but they were really good, and we'll see if we can find a way maybe at the end of the 3-part series, maybe we'll put all these questions together as one more masterclass. So thank you, Kevin, again, as always. It's exciting just to see your excitement about this topic. And one of the main things that Kevin mentioned that we can do as Red Hat is really we're just scratching the surface. So what we can do is we do have the Global Transformation Office, and what we'll be able to do is we can have an executive exchange with your executives, because top down is not the only way to make change, but it's very effective to address a lot of the things that we talked about today. So thank you, everyone, and be safe and healthy, and we'll look forward to seeing you webinar 3.